There are places in this world that do not want to be found, places that exist at the outermost edge of human cartography, where the ink of mapmakers grows thin and uncertain, where the lines that separate the known from the unknowable begin to dissolve into something porous and strange. The American interior in the year 1916 was such a place, vast beyond any honest reckoning, indifferent to the small warm creatures who moved across its surface, and haunted, in ways that no preacher or physician could adequately explain, by a silence so profound it could enter a man's mind like water enters cracked stone, slowly and with terrible patience. It was into this silence that Elias Voss walked in the autumn of that year. He was 34 years old, a surveyor by trade and a skeptic by temperament, a man who had built his entire interior life around the comfort of measurable things. He believed in instruments. He believed in the straight line, in the reliable testimony of angles and distances, in the capacity of the human mind to impose its orderly geometry upon the chaos of the natural world. He carried a theodolite, a compass, a leather-bound journal, and a Winchester rifle. He carried, too, a commission from a land speculation firm based in St. Louis, whose principals had sent him into the Utah-Nevada borderlands to survey a parcel of territory so remote that no previous surveyor had returned with anything approaching a complete account of it. This detail, that previous surveyors had failed, had returned incomplete, had returned changed, or in one case had not returned at all, was presented to Voss as a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a warning. He accepted it as such. He was, as he understood himself, not the kind of man who was troubled by warnings. The land he entered was called, by the few ranchers and drifters who had skirted its edges, the Pale. No one could say precisely when this name had attached itself to the territory, nor what authority had granted it. It appeared on no official document. It was the kind of name that arises organically from repeated human experience, the way a path is made not by intention, but by the accumulated weight of feet moving in the same direction, driven by the same unarticulated instinct. The Pale. It suggested something drained of color, something from which the vital essence had been withdrawn. The ranchers who grazed their cattle near its margins spoke of it with a casual avoidance that was itself a kind of eloquence. They did not say it was dangerous. They said only that their cattle would not graze there, that their dogs would not follow them past a certain point, that the wind that came from its interior on still evenings carried a smell they could not name, something between alkali and something older, something biological and final. Voss hired a local man named Cutter as a guide. Cutter was perhaps 50, or perhaps 70. His face had been so thoroughly worked over by sun and wind and time that conventional estimation was useless. He had gray eyes of an extraordinary paleness, the kind of eyes that seemed to be looking not at the world, but slightly behind it. He spoke rarely and with great economy, as though words were a resource he had learned to conserve. On the morning of their departure from the last settlement, a place called Ridgeline, which consisted of a general store, a water trough, and 14 human beings who regarded strangers with the particular wariness of people who have chosen obscurity deliberately. Cutter looked at Voss for a long moment before speaking. He said, "We go in, we take what readings you need, and we come out. We do not stop moving after dark. We do not answer if something calls to us by name. And we do not go near the stones." Voss wrote all of this in his journal as though it were logistical information, the way one notes the schedule of a railway or the depth of a ford. He was a man who could hear the irrational and translate it immediately into the merely eccentric. It was one of his great talents and, as events would reveal, his great vulnerability. They set out on a Tuesday. The sky above them was the particular blue of high desert autumn, a color so pure it seemed aggressive, an assault of clarity that offered no comfort. The land around them was red and tan and ochre, broken by formations of sandstone that rose from the earth like the remnants of some previous and more ambitious architecture. Ravens moved overhead in slow, deliberate circles. The air smelled of sage and mineral dust, and something drier than either of those things, something that had no name in the vocabulary of the civilized world. For the first 2 days, the work proceeded as Voss had anticipated. He took his readings, made his notations, triangulated the distances between visible landmarks with the calm pleasure of a man doing what he was made to do. The land was harsh, but comprehensible. It offered its features to his instruments without resistance. He began to think that the reputation of the Pale was precisely the kind of mythologizing that rural isolation tends to produce, the elaborate imaginative compensation of people who have too much sky and too little society, who populate the vacant spaces around them with whatever their interior lives require. On the third night, he heard something. It came from a direction he could not determine precisely, which was itself unusual. Voss was a man trained in the localization of sound, in the estimation of distance and bearing by ear. But this sound seemed to exist at no single point of origin. It seemed to arise from the landscape itself, from the rock and the sand and the cool, dark air, as though the Pale were producing it the way a body produces heat, involuntarily, as a byproduct of its own existence. It was a low sound, almost below the threshold of conscious hearing, felt more in the chest and the back of the skull than processed by the ears in any conventional way. It was rhythmic, but not regularly so. It had the irregular rhythm of breathing, or of a heart under stress, something alive but not at ease. Cutter, who had been asleep, or appeared to have been asleep, on the far side of their small fire, opened his eyes without moving any other part of his body, and said quietly, "Do not listen to it directly. Think of something else. Think of a number. Count backward from a large number, and do not stop counting until it is gone." Voss asked what it was. Cutter said he did not know what it was. He said this in a tone that suggested the question itself was somewhat naive, that the category of things whose names we know was a great deal smaller than the category of things that exist. The sound continued for what Voss estimated was 40 minutes, though when he looked at his watch at the beginning of the episode, and again at its conclusion, the elapsed time was slightly over 3 hours. He did not note this discrepancy in his journal that night. He would note it later, when the accumulation of similar discrepancies had become too large to ignore. On the fourth day, they reached the stones. They were arranged in a shallow depression in the earth, perhaps 24 of them, each roughly the size and shape of a seated human being. They were not natural formations. The angles were wrong, the surfaces too deliberate, shaped in ways that suggested purposeful subtraction, something removed rather than something accrued. They were very old. Older, Voss felt instinctively, than the civilization that had produced him. Older perhaps than any civilization he had been taught to recognize as real. They were not Native American in any tradition he had encountered in his reading or his travels. They were something else, something prior. And the word prior carried with it, as he stood at the edge of the depression and looked at them, a weight that was almost physical. Cutter stopped walking perhaps 50 feet from the edge of the depression and would not go further. Voss, whose professional purpose it was to record and measure, approached. He told himself he was being empirical. He told himself that stones were stones, that age was just time, that the discomfort he felt was the ordinary discomfort of novelty pressed upon a mind that preferred the familiar. He took out his journal and began to sketch the arrangement. He noted that the stones, despite appearing to be of the same basic geological composition as the surrounding landscape, were slightly colder than the ambient air temperature, noticeably, unnervingly colder, as though they were drawing warmth from their environment rather than existing in equilibrium with it. He noted that there were no animal tracks in the depression, no bird droppings on the stones themselves. In a landscape that was otherwise continuous with the evidence of animal life, this small hollow was surgically, deliberately empty. He was in the depression for perhaps 20 minutes before he noticed the sound beneath his feet. It was the same sound as the one he had heard 3 nights previous, but closer now, intimate in a way that was deeply wrong, the way an intimacy forced upon you by a stranger is wrong, the way a whisper in a dark room is wrong when you believed yourself to be alone. It came from the ground itself, from somewhere beneath the rock and the sand, and it was directed at him, in the way that a sound can be directed without being louder, the way a thought can be directed into a room without a word being spoken. He felt it in the soles of his feet, in his molars, in the small bones behind his eyes. He left the depression quickly. He did not run. He would record this in his journal with some private satisfaction. He did not run. But he walked with a speed and determination that communicated to Cutter everything that needed to be communicated, and Cutter simply turned and began walking in the direction they had come from without requiring further information. That night, Voss wrote in his journal for a long time. He was a precise writer, trained in the conventions of technical documentation, and he struggled with the inadequacy of that precision to capture what had occurred. He could describe the temperature differential of the stones in degrees Fahrenheit. He could sketch their arrangement with reasonable accuracy. But the sound beneath his feet, the sensation of being attended to by something that was not visible and not nameable, these things dissolved when he applied language to them, the way certain objects dissolve when exposed to light. He wrote and crossed out and wrote again, and what he was left with, finally, was a series of observations from which the most important observation was conspicuously absent. On the 5th day, he began to see the figure. It appeared first at the far limit of his vision, where distance and desert haze conspire to make the reliable uncertain. A vertical shape, human in proportion, standing still on a ridge perhaps half a mile distant. He noted it and moved on. When he looked again an hour later, it was gone. When he looked again an hour after that, it was closer. Not on the ridge now, but on a lower slope, perhaps a quarter-mile away. Still vertical, still still. The absolute stillness of something that has no need to disguise itself. He pointed it out to Cutter. Cutter looked at it for a moment with those pale eyes of his. He said, "It is the same one as yesterday." Voss had not seen it yesterday. When he said this, Cutter looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite fear, but contained elements of both, and said, "It has been there since the 2nd day, walking with us, staying at the edge of sight." The figure appeared to be wearing clothing, though the distance made certainty impossible. It appeared to be standing in an attitude of attention, not the alert attention of a hunter, but the patient, inexhaustible attention of something that has all the time that exists and knows it. It did not move while they watched it. When they turned away and turned back, it had moved. It was always, at the edge of the comfortable distance, far enough to be deniable, close enough to be felt. Voss considered the rational explanations with the thoroughness his training demanded. A prospector, a drifter, a rancher checking his range. But no prospector or drifter or rancher he had ever encountered maintained this quality of absolute stillness, this fidelity to the margins of perception, this apparent awareness of exactly how much presence could be tolerated before the human mind was forced to respond. Whatever it was, it understood the threshold. It stayed just below it, or just above it, and the navigation of that threshold was itself a form of communication. On the 6th night, Voss dreamed. He had not dreamed, as far as he was aware, since entering the Pale. This absence of dreams had registered as a comfort at first. He was a man who valued uninterrupted sleep, but as the days passed, he had begun to understand it as something else, as a kind of suppression, as though the landscape were holding something back, hoarding something, waiting. The dream, when it finally came, did not feel like a product of his own mind. It had none of the hallucinatory logic of self-generated dreams, none of the residue of the day's events rearranged by the unconscious into provisional meaning. It felt received, like a transmission, like a message composed elsewhere and delivered. In the dream, he was in the depression with the stones. It was night in the dream, but a night brighter than the actual nights of the Pale, illuminated by a moon that was too large and too close, a moon that seemed engaged rather than indifferent. The stones were arranged differently than he had observed them in daylight, or rather the arrangement was the same, but the meaning of the arrangement was visible in this light in a way it had not been in daylight. They formed a sentence, or something that functioned like a sentence, in a language that did not use symbols, but used shapes and spaces and the specific quality of shadows. He could read it. In the dream, he could read it with a fluency that felt ancient and instinctive, the way one recognizes a face before one can recall a name. He read it and understood it, and then woke abruptly in the cold dark of the desert with Cutter sitting upright beside the dead fire, and the sound in the ground and the air around them, and the figure standing, he was certain of it, just outside the circle of what had been the firelight, standing in the absolute darkness of the desert night, standing and attending. He could not remember, once woken, what the stones had said. This forgetting was not ordinary forgetting. It had weight and texture. It was a forgetting that felt deliberate. Not his own deliberation, but something else's, as though the content of the message was for a part of him that did not conduct its business in the conscious register, and the waking self was simply not the intended recipient. On the seventh day, Voss discovered he was losing time. Not in the metaphorical sense, not in the sense of becoming absorbed in work and looking up to find the afternoon gone. He was losing it in a documentable, measurable way. He would note the time in his journal, perform a task that he estimated would take 20 minutes, note the time again, and find that 90 minutes had elapsed. Or he would note 3 hours and find that 20 minutes had passed. The instrument of time had become unreliable in the Pale, or rather, the relationship between the measure of time and the experience of time had come uncoupled, the way a wheel might come uncoupled from its axle, each continuing to spin, but no longer in any useful relationship to the other. Cutter did not seem disturbed by this. Cutter seemed, if anything, more settled as the days passed, as though the deepening strangeness of the territory was for him a confirmation of something he had long understood to be true, and had simply been waiting for others to acknowledge. He did not offer explanations. He offered only occasional observations, delivered in the same tone one might use to note the weather. The figure moves faster at night. The ground near the eastern formation is louder. Do not touch the black sand in the wash. Do not look directly at the moon from inside the stone circle. Do not write your full name in the journal while you are here. Voss had, by this point, begun to understand these instructions differently than he had at the outset. What had presented itself initially as rural superstition was revealing itself as something more like a protocol, a set of behaviors refined over long experience with a specific and consistent phenomenon, the way medical procedures are refined over long experience with a specific and consistent disease. The logic was not the logic of fear or imagination. It was the logic of evidence, of repeated observation, of pragmatic accommodation to a reality that refused to behave. He began, reluctantly, and then with increasing conviction, to entertain the possibility that he was not in a landscape. He was in a presence. On the 8th day, he found the other surveyor's journal. It was in a crevice in a sandstone formation near the northern boundary of the territory he had been commissioned to survey. The journal was weather-damaged but legible, written in a hand he recognized, not from personal acquaintance but from professional correspondence. The name inside the cover was Henry Marsh, the surveyor who had been sent into the Pale 3 years before and had not returned complete. What this phrase, had not returned complete, had meant, Voss had not previously inquired. he inquired now, and Cutter, after a long pause, said, "He came back knowing things he didn't go in knowing, and not knowing things he went in knowing." He read the journal over 2 days, in whatever light was available, and what he found there was not the professional record of a surveyor, but something else, something that had begun as a surveyor's record and had transformed, page by page, into something more like a testimony, or a confession, or an attempt to put into the syntax of rational language an experience that was continually exceeding that syntax's capacity. Marsh had written, in the last legible pages, that the pail was not a place, or rather, that it was a place the way a mouth is a place, defined not by its material extent, but by its function, by what it was capable of doing. He wrote that the silence was not empty, but full of something that had been accumulating there for an unimaginable period of time, something that was patient and interested and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with physical appetite. He wrote that the figure had followed him too. He wrote that the figure was not a visitor, was not a traveler, was not a thing that had arrived from elsewhere. It was a native. It was the land's own production, the way a spring is the land's own production, welling up from what lies beneath. And then, in what appeared to be the final entry, written in a hand that was recognizable as Marsh's, but altered somehow, contracted, the letters smaller and more careful than the rest of the document, "It wants to know how we count. It wants to know how we measure. It has been here long enough to grow curious about the instruments." Voss put the journal in his pack and said nothing to Cutter about what he had read. Or rather, he said nothing that evening. But that night, lying with his eyes open in the cold and the dark, he thought about what Marsh had written and found, to his profound discomfort, that it did not surprise him. It confirmed something he had been noticing at the periphery of his own awareness for days, a quality of attention directed at him that was not hostile, was not the attention of something predatory, but was something stranger and in some ways more disturbing. It was curious. The pail was interested in him, not in his presence per se, but in what he was doing, in the specific activity of his measuring, of his imposing quantitative order on the world, as though the act of surveying, of reducing land to numbers, of subordinating the particular to the general, was something it had not encountered before and wanted to understand. On the 9th night, the figure came to the edge of the camp. Voss heard it first as a change in the quality of the silence becoming denser, more attended, the way a room changes when someone enters it even before you see them. He sat up. The fire was low but not dead. By its light he could see, just at the margin of its reach, a shape that was and was not human, that wore the silhouette of a man the way a coat rack wears a coat. The form present, but the animating substance absent, or replaced by something else entirely. He looked at it for a long time. It looked back. This looking was not an exchange of equal gazes. He was looking at it with his eyes, with the full apparatus of his visual perception, with all the interpretive mechanisms of a trained and educated human mind. It was looking at him with something he had no instrument to measure and no word to name. He felt the looking the way one feels pressure, distributed, precise, without warmth or malice, the way a geological force is without warmth or malice. He did not wake Cutter, who was either sleeping or performing the strategic unconsciousness that Voss had come to understand was itself a kind of protective behavior. He sat and looked, and was looked at, and after what his watch would later tell him was 4.5 hours, but what had felt like perhaps 30 minutes, the figure was no longer there. It did not leave. It simply ceased to be at the edge of the firelight, the way a sound ceases, not by moving away, but by ending. On the 10th day, Voss began to hear his name, not spoken aloud. There was no voice, no external acoustic event. It was more that the sound of his name arose in his mind with an external quality. Not a thought, but something deposited into the space where thoughts occur, something placed there by an agency outside himself. It was heard the way you hear a word spoken in another room, muffled by walls but recognizable. His name, Elias. His name with the particular inflection of someone who has known him long and well, who knows the weight of each syllable, who has had occasion to call him by name in contexts where great things were at stake. He did not answer. He remembered Cutter's instruction. We do not answer if something calls to us by name. He understood now that this was not superstition. It was the product of long observation of what happened when one did answer. The answer was not a beginning, it was a completion. It closed a circuit that was better left open. He wrote in his journal that day with the desperation of a man building a wall. He recorded measurements, bearings, elevations, angles of incidence, the color and composition of rock formations, the estimated height of outcroppings, the direction of prevailing winds. He surrounded himself with numbers the way one might surround oneself with light, using the quantitative as a bulwark against something that appeared to have no use for quantity. And yet, even as he did this, he understood, with the part of him that had read Marsh's final entry and recognized its truth, that this was exactly what the Pale found interesting about him. The measuring, the counting, the reduction of the world to what could be expressed in the language of number. He was performing, for its benefit, the central ritual of his civilization, and it was watching with the attention of an audience watching something that is both foreign and familiar, something that resembles a thing they know, but enacts it in ways they have not encountered. On the 11th day, Cutter said they needed to leave. Not for any reason he articulated. He said it the way you might say it is time to leave a sickbed, not because of anything that has happened, but because of a threshold crossed, a moment when continuation becomes a different kind of activity, with a different and more dangerous character. He had that morning found the black sand in the wash, the same black sand he had told Voss not to touch, disturbed, rearranged, as though something had been sitting in it or moving through it during the night. He looked at the disturbance for a long time with his pale eyes, and then said, without inflection, "We leave today." Voss did not argue. He had 7 days of measurements he had not taken, a commission not fully executed, a professional obligation that in any other circumstance would have precluded departure. He looked at his incomplete data and his incomplete maps, and felt the incompleteness not as professional failure, but as something closer to mercy, a portion of the Pale that would remain unquantified, unmeasured, unsubordinated to the language of numbers, as though the land itself had negotiated this as a condition of their release. They walked for 8 hours without stopping. Voss did not look back. This was not a superstitious instruction from Cutter. Cutter had said nothing about looking back. It was his own instinct, arising from some ancient precautionary knowledge that the body holds independently of the mind, the knowledge that the thing seen in the act of retreat is different from the thing seen in the act of advance, that the landscape behind you as you leave a place of power is charged differently than the landscape before you, that some things are only true if witnessed. He did not look back, but he heard, for the entirety of the 8 hours, the name being deposited into his mind at irregular intervals. Elias. Elias. Not calling, not demanding, simply naming, the way you might say the name of a thing you are in the process of committing to memory, rehearsing it so it will be available later. They reached the edge of the Pale, though there was no visible boundary, no fence or marker, only a quality of air and sound and light that changed, the way the air changes when you step from a cave into open ground at late afternoon. Voss stopped walking and stood for a moment. The ordinary sounds of the desert reassembled themselves around him. Wind, a bird, the settling of heated stone. The silence that had contained him for 11 days lifted, not entirely, not cleanly, but enough for him to understand by its absence how total it had been. He looked at his hands. He looked at his instruments, the theodolite, the compass, the Winchester. The tools of a man whose professional purpose was the orderly consumption of wilderness, the conversion of unknown space into the usable coordinates of human ambition. He felt, looking at these tools, something that his ordinary vocabulary did not have a precise word for. Not quite shame, not quite wonder, not quite the aftermath of fear, but something that contained elements of all three. The tools had not protected him. They had marked him, had made him interesting, had constituted his visa into a form of attention that no previous training had prepared him for. He would return to St. Louis. He would submit an incomplete survey, citing, truthfully, the difficulty of the terrain, the inadequacy of existing maps, the constraints of time and resource. The land speculation firm would express disappointment and would ultimately commission another surveyor, who would also return incomplete. The pale would remain unmeasured, unsubdivided, unsold. This was not because it was invulnerable. It was because the measuring of it required the measurer to be inside it, and the inside of it was not a neutral environment, and the instrument that suffered most in its presence was not the theodolite or the compass or the Winchester, but the surveyor himself, the human consciousness that stood behind all those tools and operated them, the self that was always, in the end, the most delicate instrument of all. Cutter did not speak again until they had ridden for 3 hours away from the pale's edge, until the lights of ridgeline were visible in the gathering dusk. Then he said, in his economical way, "Some places are older than the idea of places. You cannot survey what existed before the concept of survey. You can only move through it and hope it decides to let you out." Voss did not respond. He was thinking about the stones, about the sentence they had made in the dream light of the oversized moon, the sentence he had read with a fluency that was not his and could not be explained. He was thinking about how sometimes a forgetting is not a loss, but a protection, the psyche's last and most reliable border, the place where the self draws its final line and says, "No further. This much, but no further. Here is the limit of what I am willing to carry back into the daylight." He carried it anyway. You always do. The pale went with him in the way that a sound you've heard in the dark goes with you, not present exactly, but hovering at the edge of every subsequent silence, ready to return when the conditions are right, when the night is long enough, and the light is low enough, and the world is quiet enough, that the things living in the peripheral spaces of consciousness find the courage, or the appetite, to move toward the center. He lived another 31 years. He continued surveying, though he never returned to the Utah-Nevada borderlands, and he grew, over time, to understand his profession differently, not as the conquest of unknown space, but as a conversation with it, a negotiation, an attempt at mutual legibility between the human need for order and the world's deep and abiding indifference to that need. He became, in the estimation of his colleagues, a man of unusual caution, a man who took more time than other surveyors to complete his commissions, who spent long hours simply sitting in the landscape before he began to measure it, as though listening for something, or waiting for something, or asking permission of something he could neither see nor name. He kept the journal, Marsh's journal, until his death. He never showed it to anyone. At some point in his later years, he began writing in its margins, in the spaces around Marsh's increasingly fractured text, small annotations in his own careful technical hand. Not commentary exactly, but confirmations, places where his experience rhymed with Marsh's, where his own observations touched the other man's with the specific intimacy of two people who have been to the same place at different times and found there the same impossible and enduring thing. The last entry in Voss's own journal, dated 1947, reads as follows: "I hear it still. Not often. On certain nights when the wind is from the west and the air has that particular dry quality that is unlike any other air on earth. It is the same sound. Not a memory of the sound, but the sound itself, crossing the 30 years between that place and this one the way light crosses a vacuum, indifferent to the distance, unchanged by the passage, arriving with all its original intensity intact. And with it comes the name. My name. Spoken or deposited, or whatever the precise word is for the act of a large and patient consciousness, turning its full attention to a small and temporary one. Elias. Just that. Just the sound of who I am, spoken in a language I did not learn and cannot forget. I have stopped being afraid of it. What remains, when you subtract the fear, is something I can only describe as kinship, which is perhaps the strangest thing this world has ever asked me to feel, and the truest. The pail is still there. It has always been there, and it will be there when the instruments are dust, and the journals are dust, and the names are dust, and the men who carried them have returned to the earth that spent 11 days, 30 years ago, learning how to call them. Some measurements are never completed. Some territories are never fully charted. Some silences contain, beneath their surface, a sound so old and so patient that the whole brief drama of human civilization, its surveys and its roads, its land grants and its ambitions, its instruments of brass and steel, and the fragile biological precision of human perception, passes through them the way a stone passes through deep water, making its mark for a moment, its small and consequential disturbance, and then settling, slowly, to the place where all measured things eventually come to rest, in the unmeasurable dark.